Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are. So we're going to start today with an activity. So if you're online, I encourage you to get a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. And you'll see you have this sheet of paper. What's on it is it's pretty simple. It's 8 lines that all start with I am. And so what I encourage you to do is you're just going to take a moment to fill in that space. I'm not going to give you any instructions on how to fill these in. You just read this page and you fill in I am blank. And so we'll take about a song's length, I guess, however long we need to fill it out. Was it blank?
Yes.
Yeah, there might slip in there. That happens. And so yeah, you're just going to write some I am statements, and that's all I'm going to tell you, and then we'll look at it later. So if you need to keep writing, keep doing that, we'll start wrapping up. And you can just set this to the side. Just an activity to get the juices flowing. So today, our reading comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 7, verses 14 through 25. So this is our reading. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am fleshly, sold into slavery under sin. Did I mention earlier that this isn't the most comfy reading, by the way?
At least it's not Lamentations.
Yeah, that's just our Bible study there. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I consent that the law is good. But in fact, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that the good does not dwell within me, that is, in my flesh. For the desire to do good lies close at hand, but not the ability. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. This is hard to keep up with. A lot of double negatives and stuff. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched person that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our authority. So then, with my mind I am enslaved to the law of God, but with my flesh I am enslaved to the law of sin. What? Jacob, you're going to have to do some work on that one, right? So we are in week 2 of our boundaries series that we're calling Drawing Lines. And today our focus is on personal boundaries within ourselves. What are our limitations? How can we get to know who we really are and what we really need? And our reading this morning came from Paul's letter to the Romans, and that, like I said, it was kind of hard to read and kind of confusing to read also. And in Paul's letter, he uses this first-person perspective to explain how he wants to do good, but he does the evil things that he hates. When Paul uses the first person I here, he's not just talking about himself. Obviously, this is why he's writing it in a letter. But instead, he is talking about this collective humanity of ours. And Paul understands that we share this internal drive to do good things, but somehow our flaws lead us to do things that we do not desire to do that can cause harm. And Paul has a history that he's speaking from, of course. Paul was a Pharisee, a religious man, a Jewish man who understood and followed the laws very closely. He knew them well. And he was this religious person who for a period of his life persecuted followers of Jesus. He took it on as his mission to do this. Pharisees get a bad rap. I don't want to I'm not going to say all Pharisees were like this, but Paul was like this. Paul had this internal drive to follow his religious practices, but he also had a drive to keep out those who were altering his religious practices, like the Christians were doing, in his opinion. So Paul persecuted these Christians until he had this otherworldly encounter with Jesus, who appeared in this blinding light on the road to Damascus, and it changed the entire course of Paul's life. He completely converted in that moment. And so Paul went on to be this avid Christian, and he began writing these letters, just like this one, to the Romans, to help spread the news about Jesus, this good news about Jesus. And he wanted to do this to provide education and his theological understandings to other Christians. So that's what this is. This is one guy's take on his theology about Jesus. So Paul writes this letter to the Romans, and he's doing this with a mixed history of both being very faithful to God and also of persecuting people. So although Paul is using this universal I here, he may as well be speaking about his own experience. And as I read this text, I imagined how it would be if I were to say these words to a friend, or like my counselor, or if I was to come up and say these words to one of our fellow journeyers here. You know, the words, "I do not understand my own actions. Only sin dwells within me. When I want to do good, evil lies at hand. There is a war within myself. Wretched am I. Who will rescue me?" These words feel a bit dramatic, don't they? And they feel a little hyperbolic in a sense. And I would imagine that anyone I approached, one of y'all, anyone out in the world, if I approached them and started saying these things to them, they'd probably look at me with wide eyes and be like, "Are you okay? Can we check in for a second?" And I hope that they would stop me right there in that place and point out how critical I am being of myself and clarify that I am not all evil. So when Paul says these words, I can imagine that they were received with a bit of shock. Because we are fleshly people, as Paul says, are we completely broken by the weight of sin, as he calls it. And what are these sins of ours that make us so evil? And if evil dwells within us, who or what can save us? Tomorrow is Halloween. We know that. We're going to have trunk or treat and all. But it's also a church holiday for the Reformed traditions, and it's called Reformation Day. And so on October 31st in 1517, a German theologian and monk named Martin Luther went to the church doors in town. It'd be like someone coming up to Journey's doors. And he got a hammer and a nail, and he nailed a list called his 95 Theses onto the door of the church. And in this list, he laid out all of the sins or wrongdoings of the church as he saw it at that time. At this time, the church had been corrupted by wealth and power, and we could probably say that's happened today. And Martin Luther wanted things to change, and so he went to the church, he put this list up saying, this is all that's going wrong. At this time, it was taught by the church that you could buy your way into salvation or into heaven. The idea was even if you sinned, even if you were doing harmful things, hurting other people, as long as you could pay the church enough money for what they called indulgences, then you were guaranteed salvation. At least that is what the church leaders taught. And now you can imagine, this probably led to some harmful behaviors, but also to some really big, beautiful cathedrals. Exactly. And so the church was becoming more and more corrupt, and so Martin Luther took this stand. And he wasn't trying to split off and create another church or a new church movement, but he just wanted something to change. And so his actions, Martin Luther, his movement, became what has become the Reformed tradition that still exists today, which, if you think of the Lutheran Church, it comes from that. In a lot of ways, we are Reformed and because we are weird and funky and journey. We are kind of in that as well. And a big tenet of these Reformed traditions is that the church is reformed and is always in the process of reforming or becoming new or changing. Knowing the sins of the church and of humanity, Luther stressed that we should be open to evolving over time and course-correcting when we lose our way. And that is what the word sin relates to. This idea that we try to do something good maybe, or we just try to act in the world and somehow we miss the mark in some way. There's places where we need to, course correct. That's kind of what sin is talking about. And sin has been a huge focus of the church throughout history, right? The Church Universal has tried to lay out in detail what they believe is defined as sin, and often this was done in a way that was supporting their own power and control. But all along, sin was supposed to be this idea that we can do things that go against God and our neighbor, one another, that can cause harm for ourselves and the world. And while it would be convenient to have a nice handy list of don't do these things, this is a sin, this is not a sin, I can't give that to you. I don't know, You can look in Scripture, you can look in the world and try to figure it out for yourself. But we know there are things we can do that cause harm. And in the time of Paul's letter that he wrote here to the Romans, Paul was having to wrestle with what was sin. Paul had grown up in the Jewish tradition, and he knew the laws that outlined ways in which one could live in communion with God. These laws, these rules, the Torah as they had it, helped people know when they were missing the mark in some way. It was a guide, per se, to help people stay in relationship with God. It was their best attempt at doing that. And Paul saw that it was good to know the laws, and he thought that the rules brought forth positive things. He really saw that. But Paul also knew that even in following the laws, he could still fall short. Paul understood that the laws were not complete, and that even in his desire to do good and be a good person, he could still sin, as he calls it. Paul understood that we are all this mixed bag of good and not so good, right? Both Paul and Martin Luther saw what happens when people become ignorant to their own shortcomings, blinded by it. So Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, and Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And I think it's healthy work to assess our own shortcomings every now and then. I do not think we need to be as hard on ourselves as Paul was, this sin dwells within me. But I think Paul raises a great point here. Do we ever fully know ourselves and our intentions? To a degree, we do know ourselves, right? We are the experts in our own personality, our own selves. But sometimes we lose track of what causes good and what can cause harm. Sometimes power and privilege, money, etc., all of that gets in the way, and we lose sight, or we sin, as Paul may say. And this is where I think boundaries come into play. This series is all about boundaries. How do we look within and set limitations on what we do and don't do so that we do not fall prey to harmful systems that are corrupt and damage the lives of others? I would suggest that we first have to get to know who we are and what we believe, what we value. And once we find our values, then we can look at how we behave in the world, right? We open this kind of case study in ourselves, and we see if our values are really guiding our actions, and if they're not, we get to course correct. Amen. The boundaries between me, myself, and I are boundaries that only we can set. We can't set each other's boundaries. And I think Paul's letter is an example of someone who is wrestling with their own boundaries. It sounds like someone who is trying to do good and is shocked to see that their actions may not live up to their values. But don't worry, Paul would remind us that even if we get in this negative headspace and think that evil dwells within us, that woe is me, that grace meets us right where we're at, even in that space. And in that space, we can redefine our boundaries and our limitations, and we get to try again. In our activity this morning, I asked you to write out 8 I am statements. I didn't give you any instructions. I didn't want to ruin the surprise. There's not really any surprise here. But I invite you to look back at what you wrote on your list. If you were to hand this to someone else, would this describe who you are? Could they pick you out in a lineup? Is this a definitive list of what makes you you? What did you include in this I am list? Did you include your physical characteristics, your age, your job, your professional titles? Did you list characteristics of your personality, what makes you happy, who you're connected to? Did you include the groups and organizations you're a part of? Or did you happen to list that you're a dreadful sinner who could only do evil when intending to do good?
I do read my books.
I hope y'all didn't. I hope that didn't come across some of yours. But if you did, Paul would be on the same boat, I think. And I think this list is the first step. This is just an activity to get your creative juices flowing, like I said. And I think this is a way that we can start to define what our bounds are. When we learn who we are and how we identify in this world, we can see what space we inhabit, what space we take up in this world. And then we can start to see, okay, this is a space I take up. Well, this is where my boundaries lie around that. And although Paul seems to think that we cannot fully know ourselves, we do know who we are. We do know more about ourselves than he gives us credit, even if we don't fully know ourselves. So I think we're encouraged to do this type of self-reflection, figuring out what we need, what our limits are, who we are. So in the weeks to come, what we're going to do is we're going to look at our personal boundaries, the things that we're starting to think of right now, and we're going to see how they're reflected in our families and in the world, how they coincide with that. We're also going to see how they conflict with those spaces. Sometimes that happens. And if there are things that conflict with our values and make us feel like we're doing something and things that we find harmful, that we don't desire to do, what we can do is we get to create a boundary there and say, I no longer want to do that kind of thing. And sometimes it takes us crossing the bounds and doing things we find hurtful to realize that we have gone beyond our limits, right? And I want to say, we are not enslaved to the law of sin, as Paul says. I think there's more grace than that. I think we have freedom to learn and grow and change and redefine. And as we look within and explore these boundaries, we may want to imagine what these boundaries are for us. What are our boundaries when it comes to our jobs, maybe? And our time with our jobs, or our time with our families, or how about our boundaries with our families and our emotions? Or what are the boundaries around our mental health and our physical bodies that we don't want people to cross those boundaries? What are the things that make us feel good and safe and aligned with who we want to be and what we value in this world? May we be encouraged to explore this holy space. And may we have more grace for ourselves than Paul seemed to have in our reading today. Knowing that we are good people, that even when we fall short, we can be reformed, as Martin Luther was doing. And we can grow, and we can and come into these healthier boundaries and these healthier spaces. And these can reflect the good that we want to be in the world. May it be so. Amen.
Amen. Find a blessing today. It's going to be hard. There are two boundaries that we have in our own lives. We've got a gravestone, a birthday, and a death day. But those dates don't define that person. There's a line that's drawn that bridges those dates. It's called the dash. That's who you really are. So my challenge to you today is, be the best dash that you can be. Because that's really who you are and who God created you to be. Don't let those 2 days define anyone that you know and love. Let that dash define them. Go in peace. Amen.